Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webinar in the Diversity Matters webinar series. First of all, there's something technical. We have made the meeting basically open, so it's up to you to please switch your camera off and mute yourself. More importantly, the camera is secondary. That will be our normal setting here. The topic for today is migration policy implementation in Latin America and Europe. We will have 3 speakers with relatively short presentations lined up. So it makes sense to have all the questions and discussions at the end. We aim to be done in just 1 hour. We have 3 speakers today. They are Leiza Brumat, Marcia, Vera, Espinoza, and Federica Infantino. They will use a variety of research methods, or that they have used already in their work, and will shed light on the wide range of actors, ideas, interests, and key tensions involved in the implementation of refugee and migration policies in Europe and Latin America. So the webinar series more broadly is hosted here by the Migrations and Diversities Research Group at EURAC Research. It takes an interdisciplinary approach, as you probably guessed by now, and explores the impact of migrations, diversities, and mobilities on increasingly super diverse territorial realities. One more note on the technical side, please note that the webinar is recorded for future generations because they will definitely want to know about this. Let me start with introducing our first speaker, Leiza Brumat. She's a senior researcher here at the European Academy Bolzano, in short, EURAC. In the Institute for Minority Rights, she's working on multi-level migration governance in South America with a focus on policies that liberalize the movement of persons. She previously worked for a number of years as a research fellow at the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute, and as a lecturer in Buenos Aires, where she also obtained her PhD in political science and international relations. Leiza, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frederic, for the presentation, and thanks again for everyone for being here, and especially Federica and Marcia for joining us for this webinar series. Now, I will share my presentation with you, and I would like first to let you know, can you see it? Can you see the presentation correctly? Okay, great. First, I would like to say that this webinar has been organized as part of my research project, which is called POLIM. As Frederic just mentioned, is policy implementation in global South regionalism, multi-level migration governance in South America. So as part of this project, I've organized a series of events, including this webinar. And now I will explain this to you further. So what is this project about? As I just mentioned, it's about policy implementation in global South regionalism, and the main question that drives the interest of this project is how and why do countries voluntarily implement regional migration policies in the absence of supranational enforcement mechanisms and in weaker institutional settings. What is a supranational enforcement mechanisms? When I talk about that, I'm referring to mechanisms of control, of enforcement, of the implementation of policies, of policy implementation and policy compliance. For instance, the European Tribunal or the European Commission that control states so that ensure that states actually comply with their commitments, with their regional commitments. However, this compliance and enforcement mechanisms exist mostly and only in the European regional integration. However, that they do not exist in rest of the world regional integration projects. That's why I'm focusing on the implementation of regional migration policies in South America in particular. Why South America? South America, I will argue that is interesting for a number of reasons, not only because it's a beautiful part of the world, but also because Most, as we know right now, most of human mobility happens within regions in the global south, in the so-called global south. So most mobility, most human mobility is intra-regional, and it happens south-south. Also because Mercosur is one of the most developed regional integration processes after the European project, and because South America has developed in the last few decades the most progressive and the most liberal migration and asylum policies in the world, and there's a whole strand of literature that looks into the reasons and why this is the case, and the characteristics of this progressive and liberal migration legislation and policies. However, at the same time, South American regionalism is very, very frequently labeled as weak, with lax institutions or light or soft institutions, and as strongly intergovernmental. And there is the idea that regionalism and regional integration in South America has failed is very much present. However, as I said before, we should take into account that most regional integration projects have a lax institutionalization, are weak, do not have supranational enforcement mechanisms, and are strongly intergovernmental. At the same time, literature says that there is a gap between these very progressive and liberal policies and their implementation. However, there are no systematic, or there is an absence of systematic and encompassing studies on the implementation of these regional policies, of these progressive and liberal policies for human mobility. What we do know is that millions of people had access to a regular residence in the region using regional frameworks, and that every day thousands of border crossings happen using facilitated procedures adopted at the regional level. So, in the absence of systematic studies on policy implementation in the region, can we actually say that regional migration policies in South America have failed? And why, if they are implemented, why are these policies implemented in the absence of these enforcement and control mechanisms? To address these questions, I have two main objectives for this project. The first one is to map the implementation of the policies, and among all the methods and data that I have already collected to do this, I'm doing a literature review, and I will explain right now only this literature review, which I'm currently undergoing. And objective two is the why question. Why do countries implement these policies? And to do this, I've already done field work in South America, and I've done around 40 semi-structured interviews in Argentina and Brazil. So going to this research paper, this one paper in particular, which seeks to answer the how question. How do countries implement these policies? The driving question for this paper is, what does the literature on regionalism and migration governance tell us about the implementation of regional migration policies? Do we see the effective reach of regional norms, international context, or are these responses adapted, rejected, or ignored? What does the literature say about regional policy implementation, and how does this play out in the global south and in South America in particular? To do this, I've gathered around, and I will explain that around 600 documents and literature that addresses policy implementation, the implementation of regional migration policies in global south regionalism, internalism in the global south. What I propose to do with this literature is to distinguish between three main concepts. My intuition tells me that there is a very strong focus on policy failure and on implementation gaps because there is a confusion in the literature between three concepts, which are institutionalization, implementation, and compliance. Institutionalization and implementation are processes. Institutionalization is a process of the emergence and adoption of policies, while implementation refers to the adaptation and translation of these policies on the ground. It's a multi-level process that shapes the policies. While compliance is response to a yes or no question. I mean, compliance is an absolute property. It's a domestic process that refers to rule following, yes or no question. Then I propose to distinguish between three types of gaps between policies and their implementation. There are discursive gaps, there are implementation gaps, and there are efficacy gaps. And we need to distinguish between these different types of gaps. And then also we need to distinguish between different types of outcomes of policy implementation, which can be based on previous research, adoption, which leads to isomorphism, which is increased resemblance or similarities between the policies, adaptation, which refers to the selective adoption of some policies and adjustment with national colors, resistance, which seeks to undermine policies while not completely rejecting them, because rejection is the last and fourth outcome. So to do this and to distinguish between these different types of gaps and different types of concepts addressing policy implementation, I've done and I'm currently undergoing a systematic review. A systematic review defined a field of study. I propose to do a plural approach and to go beyond top journals. So I've gathered PhD, thesis, and gray literature, including working papers, but also going beyond top journals, Latin American journals, for instance, that are mostly in Portuguese and Spanish, because a lot of this literature is in Portuguese and Spanish. I'm currently doing didactic coding, building from the concepts that I just mentioned, and I've run two groups of searches. First one, the one on policy implementation and journalism, which led me to finding about 153 documents, and the second one on policy implementation, regionalism, and migration, which led me to collect around 500 documents. And empirical results, unfortunately, are work in progress. But this contribution that I expect to do with this study is to provide a general and systematic review of the literature that analyzes the concepts that are mostly used in the specialized scholarship and the reasons that explain the famous gap between policies and their implementation. I want to systematically analyze what this literature has said to shed light on the prevailing analytical and conceptual lenses, and maybe also the biases that the literature has on policy implementation, on migration policy implementation, because I want to finally unpack the mechanisms at play behind the gap between policies on paper and policies on the ground. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Leiza. I hope you can hear me also now with the microphone. I think you can. And we will move on to our second speaker. Let me briefly introduce Marcia to you. Marcia Vera Espinoza is a reader at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. In the Institute of Global Health and Development, she leads the research cluster on psychosocial well-being, integration and protection. Previously, Marcia was a lecturer in human geography at Queen Mary University in London, so there's clearly a royal theme emerging here. Before she got her PhD from the University of Sheffield, she was already writing on migration in Latin America, then as a journalist. Marcia, thanks for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Federica. And I have to say that the royal connotation is not intended. have to mention that, but clearly a pattern there. And thanks to my colleague Leiza as well for inviting me, and Federica for hosting me in this seminar. And what I want to present, we discuss with you today, follow up really from some of the ideas and concepts that Leiza was outlining in her project, particularly in trying to understand some of the implementation of these regional frameworks into specific countries. And I'm going to bring a specific case study to show you a little bit from the practice how some of these ideas might play out. So my presentation will look at the tensions, gaps, and challenges in the implementation of refugee law and policy in Chile. And just to give you an overview, although some of these ideas might be well known to you, or maybe not, some of you that might be new to the context of Latin America, but Latin America has been considered unique in terms of refugee protection, really as a result of a complex coexistence of different protection regimes and systems across international, regional, and national levels. And these include, of course, the adoption of at least, 15 countries of the region of the Refugee Convention of 1951 and the Protocol of 1967, the adoption of the Global Compact on Refugees, but also a quite progressive and elaborated regional framework, which cornerstones is the Cartagena Declaration of 1984, and the entire regime derived from this review process. So the Cartagena Declaration not only expands the refugee definition of the 1951 Convention, but it also set up a mechanism of review of every 10 years. So every 10 years, a country of Latin America and the Caribbean come together to assess what are the displacement challenges that we face in the region at that time, how the protection mechanisms are working, and try to propose a roadmap of very practical steps that the state can take to implement some of these changes and also some of the instruments that are already being adopted. At the regional level, we also have the Inter-American Human Rights System that is within the Organization of American States. And at the same time, we have a number of national legislation, some of them specifics, to refugee protection, but also there are migration laws and complementary measures that might expand some of the protection spaces or not for refugee and displaced population. Now, within the regional aspect, and Leiza has contributed to this understanding as well, we have other mechanisms such as the Mercosur and some protections that might be used as well in terms of refugee protection. And in the book that I have on the slide, one of the chapters that Leiza wrote tried to analyze the use of Mercosur or the possibilities of using the Mercosur in terms of refugee protection. Now, today I'm going to focus specifically on Chile. And you might ask me why Chile is important. Why there's, of course, a real bias here because I'm Chilean myself, so Chile has been the focus of my research for many years. But also it's an interesting case study since it's in the last 10 years has transformed from receiving a total of 1% of the total population as a foreign, as an immigrant population, including displaced refugee population, but in more recently has reached almost and surpassed more than 8% of the total amount of the Chilean population. This is not only, but mainly for the displacement of Venezuelans, as many of you may know, since 2015, 2014, have displaced across the region due to the political and economic challenges in the country. And they have displaced across Latin America. So they also have reached Europe and the United States, but it's important to emphasize that at least 80% of the refugee population, more than the 6 million people now displaced, has stayed in countries of the region. Of course, some of the most affected countries are neighbors countries, such as Colombia, and there's some more people as well in Ecuador, but then Venezuelans start moving throughout the region to countries such as Peru, that transformed from being an immigration country and a transit country to also being a recipient country. But then we have other cases such as the one of Brazil, Argentina, and also Chile. And Chile received a first wave of Venezuelan displacement and they have continued receiving until today. And I think that set up a little bit the discussion that we're going to have today in terms of displacement dynamics. Now, in the context of Chile, in 2010, it was promulgated the current refugee law that is the law number 2040-30, and this law set it out quite progressively a number of rights and duties for refugees and the procedures and guidelines for refugee status determination. You also established the principles of non-refoulement, confidentiality, and also the principles of non-discrimination, which guarantee, in theory, the right not to be rejected at the border and not to be sanctioned for irregular entry, something that has changed with the further shift to criminalization of migration that we have experienced in the country. Now, Chile ratified the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol, and the definition of refugee of the Convention is included in the refugee law. Not only that one, the law also contemplates the expanded definition of the Cartagena Declaration that also, recognize refugees in relation to cases of generalized violence and other specific, cases that might apply to the displaced population from the region. What is important here, and I apologize that I put the statistic in Spanish, but it comes from one of the studies that is based in this presentation. And I just want to emphasize here that what we try to show in this statistic is that since 2010, when the law was implemented, up to 2022, there has been a massive increment of asylum requests in the country. And even when it was a small number, what you can see in the blue color is that those ones that have been processed. The ones in red are the ones that have been rejected, and the ones in yellow are the number that has been recognized. So as you can see, it's already the smaller number of refugee recognition. Even if they're being considered, many of them have been rejected. Now, what I wanted to present in the next couple of 10 minutes very briefly is based in two studies. One of them that we have developed with colleagues from the research group Caminar, which is Comparative Migration and Displacement in the Americas, and it's a paper that is coming out in June in the Journal of Immigrant and Refugee Studies that we have done with my colleagues Gisela Zapata, Luciana Gandina, and Victoria Prieto Rosas, and it's titled Weakening Practice Amidst Progressive Laws, Refugee Governance in Latin America During COVID-19. And this is a comparative study that looks at the cases of Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and Uruguay using a mixed methodology. We use a descriptive analysis of asylum and refugee data, both from the UNHCR and from the different countries. We review the main refugee legal frameworks and decrees, administrative acts, etc., before and during the pandemic. And also we conducted 51 online semi-structured interviews between June and September of 2020. So really during the first 8 months, the first year of the pandemic. And second, also links to this report that we produced with 3 Chilean colleagues for the Centro de Políticas Migratorias, a new center of migration studies in Chile that it really aims to contribute with proposals, and is really looking to explore specifically the refugee law and what are the tensions in terms of implementation. And for this one, we also did a review of the existing literature, an analysis of the policies and the relevant laws, but we also developed a participatory workshop with 11 experts that including members of civil society, the government, the National Migration Office in Chile, some politicians, and also international organizations. And following up from that workshop, we did 6 semi-structured interviews with the specific key informants working within the system. We really wanted to understand why the law is not implemented as it should. So I invite you to read, if any of you read Spanish, you can look at that report as well. Now, and I'm not going to stop that much on this because I know we don't have that much time, but just to let you know, particularly in the first paper, our theoretical framework really draws from 2 key ideas. One, looking at De Lucas and his idea of the vaciamiento or the hollowing out of asylum systems that particularly look at European context. And then we have the death of asylum of Alison Mounts that takes further this idea of the hollowing out of asylum and invite us to think about the physical, the ontological, and the political death of asylum. Now, we don't see necessarily a death of asylum in Latin America, but we do consider, this is the argument that we develop in the paper, an accelerated weakening of asylum. That's what we try to show by looking at the 4 cases that we explore. But also we take these ideas in the context of multiple crises and exceptionality that we review in a recently published book with Gisela and Luciana and all the colleagues of Caminar, in which we try to mainly look at the processes of refugee and migrant integration and how the pandemic impacted those processes. And this idea is not new as well. I know the colleagues, Lucy Pedrosa as well, Ana Margaritis, have also taken this idea of the multiple crises or the nested crisis to try to explain some of the changes in migration policies in Latin American countries. Now, going to some of the tensions and gaps and challenges. When the Chilean refugee law was promoted, it was really considered one of the most progressive frameworks that contains important provisions that enhance refugee protection and that even provide similar rights and access to refugee population as of any other Chilean. However, from the beginning, the implementation of the law was strongly criticized, not only by civil society organizations, by academic, by international organizations, but more recently as well by the controller of the General Republic. So the state itself, some of the the body that provides check and balances of how the state is working, they released a very diminished report of how was the state of refugee protection in Latin America. And there are 3 points that are very important here. One is the delays on the requirement and the requirements of processes not contemplated in the law. And this mainly relates to pre-admissibility interviews. That means that when the refugee person arrived to the border, before the officer could say, here is your application to request asylum, they would do a pre-admissibility interview that is not contemplated on the law. So basically the border officer will say, you can apply or you cannot apply for asylum. That is not part of the legislation. It is actually considered illegal by the controller. And also there are not instructions or procedure manuals for the formalization of refugee status. So basically everything is very loose and open to interpretation. Now, in the report that we conducted now in 2023, we also explore other set of challenges. One of them, for example, is the administrative challenge. So as you can see, between 2017 and 2022, there were more than 22,000 applications submitted, but only 7,000 have been resolved in the same period, so a smaller amount. And from that total number, only 448 people has been recognized as refugees and the rest has been rejected. So we can see a massive gap between those numbers. But what it came out from our interviews as well is that there's a lack of administrative capacity. From the 23 people that conform the team of the National Service of Migration, only few of them are working this application. And the capacity that they have it as per month, they can analyze up to 100. But with a massive amount of applications coming, they really don't have capacity to explore them. We also have the legal challenges that we already knew. Chile has not applied, as Brazil or as Mexico, the expanded definition of the Cartagena Declaration that is contemplated in the law, and they haven't used either the group recognition that Brazil has used for refugee protection or the prima facie. So those instruments, those legal instruments, are part of the law, but are not being used. Then we have the tensions with the migration policy. One of the things that came out often from the experts, from people working in the National Service of Migration, is that if they promote the use of the refugee as a figure, they might encourage more migration. So there's this fear from policymakers in terms of, if we use refugee law, we're actually going to promote more migration to Chile through illegal channels or trochas, as they call them in many countries. And we also identify a lack of integration and resettlement programs that also influence the lack and the tension of the implementation. I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to fly through the slides and come to the key point, but I invite you to read the paper and the report as well. So let me go very quickly. What we do in the paper is we analyze the 4 cases together, and we try to look at the implementation of the asylum law before the pandemic. So we kind of set it up some specific aspect like the asylum framework, the application of the expanded definition of Cartagena, and the practices that weaken asylum. And then this is the same numbers that I showed you before. And then we look at how this one changed during the pandemic, particularly in relation to the closure of borders and the militarization of borders, that they were further, justified through the epidemiological control of the pandemic, but that also has weakened the asylum protection system. During our interviews, this also came out, there has been, the waiting time was already around 3 years, but has increased since the pandemic. There has been a push for the digitalization of migration procedures. However, asylum seekers can only update their contact details and apply for an extension, not necessarily to make the requirement online, as in other countries. But the research so far has also shown that there's a limited effect of this digital turn in speeding up some of the processes. So digitalization doesn't necessarily equal, a faster procedure, because still the capacity of the team is quite small. And what we also know is that because of the borders were already closed for asylum seekers with a rejection so high, and because of all the issues and all the barriers that they were imposed for them before they can apply for asylum, there has been a massive increase of arrivals by unauthorized crossings. So really what we see here is that the most barriers that are imposed to asylum seekers, the number of irregular migrants increase in many countries. And we have seen this in other places across the world as well. And I'm just going to go to the conclusions here, but just one more point to say, what we have seen in Chile as well is a massive politicization of migration, not only by the increased numbers, but they also has been linked to even the constitutional process. So when we were deciding and voting for the new constitution, a process that has changed in the last 2 years, the topic of refugee and migration also emerged as a fear campaign of people, similar to what happened with Brexit, in terms of saying, the new constitution might promote more migration. So with this, I'm just going to finish and say that what we propose in the paper, and we discuss as well in the report, is that, of course, we have seen an accelerating weakening of refugee protection that has been further exacerbated by the pandemic. And by the weakening of refugee protection, we refer to the increased regressive implementation of national and regional frameworks, as well as the use of a specific but also interrelated technical legal provisions and political institutional practices that weakened the asylum system before and during the pandemic, which can result in the undermining, the abandonment, or the replacement of the region widely praised refugee governance. And of course, we have a very complex scenario where the progressive law and the progressive legal framework coexist with the implementation of illegal practices that impede people really seek asylum at the border. We have the slow recognition rates. We have an increased politicization of asylum. And what we have seen taking shape, particularly in the case of Chile, is a rebordering of the asylum beyond, but also within the territory. I just want to finish. We invite you to look at some of the publications of Caminar in our website, and then you have my email as well in case you have any questions. Thank you. I'm sorry for the extra minutes.
Not at all. That was still well in time. Thank you very much, Marcia. Also some very skilled advertising for looking up papers. Yes, thank you very much. So we move on to our third speaker today, Federica Infantino. She is currently a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow at the Migration Policy Center of the European University Institute near Florence. And she's doing research on the role of practitioners in shaping migration management and border control on the ground, with a particular focus on non-state actors. After obtaining her PhD from Sciences Po in Paris and from the Free University of Brussels, she was a postdoc in the Compass Center at the University of Oxford and then a junior research fellow at Wolfson College. Federica, it's great to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I'd like to thank Leiza and EURAC for giving me this opportunity to share my research on private companies in particular. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yes. Okay. Cool. Yes. So I thought of contributing to today's webinar by focusing really on a particular aspect of the implementation of migration and border control, which is the role and involvement of private companies in the implementation, really on the ground. So what I'm going to talk about is really what we can define as a street level implementation. And what is the role played by private companies. In the delegation of this government's functions is a topic that has received much scholarly attention in multiple fields of research, and in particular in the domains of borders and migration control, because it is particularly challenging, puzzling to see how private companies are involved in an area so emblematic of state sovereignty. So there is a large scholarship focusing on this, focusing in particular on what are the implications for state sovereignty, for the rule of law, for nation-state building, for the making of the European Union, but also what are the effects of the outsourcing to private companies on migratory movements and policy outcomes. Or others have, like Thomas Bard, Didier Bigot, Julien Jean Desbos, they have worked a lot on how the security industry in particular has shaped the approach, the EU approach to border security, and on the digitalization of border control in particular, which creates, I think, a nice link with what has been just said about digitalization. And here we have a huge role of private companies. Then this, I mean, I speak to that literature, but I pursue the implementation approach. And in the literature in public administration, the sociology of public action, the outsourcing to private companies is at the center of academic debates. So this is also many insights can be brought from that kind of literature. So what I do and what I'm doing in my research is to focus. So I follow the lines of scholars who work on migration and border control by focusing on policy processes rather than policy outputs. So like only the results like laws or policy on paper. So I focus on policy processes, but by considering the implementation as a policy process, because the implementation is a stage of policymaking. Policymaking is ubiquitous, so meaning that policymaking does not end with the design. So it's not like you design a policy and then you take for granted its implementation. The implementation deserves an analysis in its own right. So in this presentation in particular, I'm building on empirical research I've been conducting for many years on the implementation of visa policy, of immigration detention, and asylum reception. And it's really my work has focused really on the organizations on the ground, state and non-state organizations that implement these policies. And I will bring insights on three aspects in particular. First of all, why do states delegate day-to-day implementation? What policy goals do they achieve? And what are the effects on the ground? And I will also draw some directions for comparative research with other regions of the world that could be pursued. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about in reality, I'm talking about of these places, like these are places where I've conducted, some of the places where I've conducted my research. This is a visa application center run by the company VFS Global for the Consulate of Belgium and Italy in Casablanca in Morocco, or this is another place where one of my fieldwork sites is the Colnbrook Immigration Removal Center in the United Kingdom, is the a detention center close to Heathrow Airport, which is run by Mighty, which is a private company. The private service providers I focused in particular are global players, so are these huge companies. We might have had some experience of these companies in our lives, like G4S. Sometimes we might encounter G4S in airports when we travel. So these are really big companies. Serco and G4S are involved in detention centers, in asylum reception, in many parts of the world. These are really global players. And VFS Global and TLS Contact are two private companies that are specialized in the outsourcing of visa services. And when we talk about outsourcing of visa services, we are really talking of a global phenomenon. There's also a lot of research conducted in Latin America on this, in South America on these companies. These are, the important thing to say is that these companies are involved in migration and border control because for them, this is a business opportunity. So this makes a big difference with those companies like carriers, which are private actors, which are those who check our documents when we want to travel, and they are co-opted in migration and border control because otherwise they are fined. So to them, it's not a business opportunity. Here we are really talking of companies that for whom the outsourcing is a business opportunity. So the point here I'm making, and I've been making in my work, is that states achieve a series of goals by outsourcing policy implementation. So usually the justifications used to justify outsourcing are cost-benefit logics. So outsourcing should allow reducing costs for shrinking public budgets. Now, in my analysis, I put forward also other kinds of arguments that explain the diffusion of outsourcing, which are more related to the advantages effects that the outsourcing represent for state actors. And these effects are particularly visible when we look at the implementation on the ground. And in the case, for instance, of visa policy, these advantages concern the fact of redirecting the economic and non-economic burdens of implementing EU visa policy, in particular according to EU rules, and also the fact that state actors manage to get rid of responsibility of policy implementation and to avoid blame by delegating some functions to private actors. And to illustrate this argument, I will let really the implementers speak. And for instance, the Consul General of France in Casablanca, when asked about the advantage of outsourcing the visa application process, he says it results in less stress. The main effect is that if there are some problems, it's not us, but the company. Nobody can say they don't work enough or they are trafficking. So we really see the blame avoidance here. And similarly, the Deputy Director of Detention Operations in the Home Office in the United Kingdom describes the outsourcing in these terms. It says they carry a lot of the risk. It's a sort of low-level operational and management risk in the center. So if something bad happens in the center, the Home Office, you know, doesn't have direct responsibility. So states achieve goals and become more capable of governing. In this sense, if we understand sovereignty as the capacity of governing, outsourcing strengthens state sovereignty because it allows to achieve a series of goals. And also in the case, this is a case an argument I made in particular for the outsourcing of visa policy, but similarly we see it in the outsourcing of immigration detention and deportation. In the empirical analysis of private and public cooperation in day-to-day implementation shows how the state actors outsource the use of legitimate violence, whereas the state can focus on obtaining detainees' consent to leave by persuading, advising, and threatening. And this is an argument I've made in a recently published book by Oxford University Press that I really suggest for all those interested in this topic. It's called Privatizing Border Control. It's edited by Mary Bosworth and Lucia Zedner. Then another aspect that can be analyzed when looking at the outsourcing of the implementation of migration border control are the effects on the ground. So when there is another actor implementing a policy on government behalf, new organizational routines are established. That means that the action of private companies is not neutral because they change the conditions in which policies are implemented. They change the organizational conditions. And so new organizational routines are established. And this is something I've also described in detail in my writing about these forms of outsourcing. There are another very strong kind of effects that one can see if we take the perspective of policy recipients. So the outsourcing, the fact of having an intermediary between the governing and the governed, diminish the opportunities for the governed to seek redress, to make claims on the state. They diminish the possibilities of contestation. All aspects of policy implementation, and in particular of what has been defined the public encounter. When the public encounter is delegated to a private actor, because state actors do not encounter policy recipients anymore in most of these cases, there are effects on what happens when these governing and governed are encountered. The last aspect, and I think this can be a fruitful avenue for comparisons with other parts of the world, is how these private companies become actors of transfer and how they shape organizational decisions and change beyond national borders, and because these are global players that work with many different nation states, they actually transfer way of doing things, practices, organizational arrangements, ideas, and this has an impact on policymaking on the ground, independently of changes on the policy design. And so this really, I think, gives us further ideas on how to address comparisons, in particular forms of transnational comparisons, interested in assessing the interdependencies between different contexts and the actors and processes involved in these different forms of diffusion and transfer, this time of policy practices, not really of policies on paper. And also, I mean, I think there is scope for future research in different national contexts, only simply when it comes to address how private companies shape policy processes on the ground. And I'll stop here, hoping that I haven't taken too much time.
Thank you very much, Federica. I saw that you summarized your recent book in one bullet point. Now, of course, I'm wondering how many of the bullet points had books behind them. Could be a lot of books there. Thank you very much. We can move to some questions. Please feel free to ask any questions to any of the speakers or any subset of all speakers. You can type that in the chat and we will see it, or since that's possible today, you can also ask the question verbally if that is possibly a lot easier than typing it out. Please, any questions?
Before, maybe some people today will before some people leave, I would like to make an advertisement. As part of the project, I'm also organizing a mini conference we're organizing here at URAC together with Carolina Zuccotti, who also studies migration policy implementation and particularly the integration, social integration of migrants in Europe and in Latin America here at URAC on November the 9th. So everyone's invited to come here. It will be a hybrid event or to follow it online. We will continue with this dialogue, EU, Latin America, on migration governance and migration implementation. And I would like to thank again Federica and Marcia for being here. They are leading scholars both on migration governance in Europe and South America and Latin America in general, and it's an absolute honor to have them here.
So far, I don't see questions yet. So let me ask one to, Federica.
You can go first if you'd like. Shall I go? Okay. I have one question for both of you because I found very interesting your description of the gap in South America. So if I understood well, what you're claiming is that there are liberal policies that become more restrictive on the ground. And it's quite kind of interesting because it's a kind of opposite gap than the gap described in the literature with for the European context, because the idea of the gap comes from the fact that there are restrictive policies that actually do not achieve their outcome on the ground. So I found this really fascinating. But in the end, might be that the result is the same. So restrictiveness as a tendency on the ground, which of course, I mean, more research should prove wrong. So I only had this comment, and I wanted to know if I understood well your argument.
Yeah, it's basically that. However, I also want to study more systematically whether these policies are that restrictive or not. My intuition is that it really depends on multi-level governance. It really depends on the migrant and where the migrant ends up in. That is, which border the person crosses, in which moment, from which country, and where this person happens to ask for regularization, which municipality and which bureaucrat this person ends up facing. All of these factors will have an impact on the set of rights that this person, that South American migrants in South America, have access to. Because it really, it really depends on the capacities that each level of government has in the region, in a region which is the most unequal in the world.
Just to complement what Leiza is saying, that's exactly what we have seen as well. You know, there's a multi-level implementation of policy. So what we really see in the context of South America and Latin America at large is at the regional level is quite progressive, and even the national legislations tend to be progressive in line with those regional international commitments. And of course, there's a historical moment, Federica. Many of these legislation happened after the dictatorial periods, you know, in Latin America. So after when we came back to democracy. So there was an intention from many of these countries to show themselves as good players of the international community, you know, and they implemented and adopted many of this legislation regionally and nationally. What we see is that in the context of Chile, for example, but other countries as well, is that the law is not necessarily being implemented or used with the tools and provisions that are there. So we actually see as a misuse, a disuse, you know, or actually in some cases, the use of new legal categories in order not to use the refugee figure itself. So they prefer to create more complementary pathways in order to create other legal migrant categories instead of promoting the use of refugee and asylum. And of course, one of the interesting things that Leiza and myself have explored in other projects as well is that, of course, ideas from global north countries, from the United States, from Europe, from Australia, they are diffused into other regions such as Latin America. So when many times you interview policymakers, they actually use other countries as example of what the system should be. So for example, when there are an implementation and change of law in Chile, the national service officers keep telling us, because we want to be modern like other countries and use a points-based system. So actually the ideas of restrictiveness are being implemented, takes an example as well to be used. Externalization is something that we also seen in the region, and the examples are taken from Australia and from Europe, as well as from the United States, of course. And I have to say that we have some exception, though. In the paper, we emphasize that Uruguay is a key exception in terms of having more aligned implementation with the regional commitments that they have made.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of Italy when it had to join the Schengen Agreement, and really Italy had a very different migration policy or approach on border control than the then members of the Schengen Agreement. And to join the Schengen Agreement, the idea would be to join the European club, you have to be less liberal. So really interesting, yeah.
And can we put a question back for Federica? Because what you say, Federica, I also found it very interesting. There was some conversation in Chile, particularly now where the migration issue has been, portrayed politically quite widely in terms of trying to implement some detention centers. It didn't happen at the end, and it hasn't happened yet. But I wanted to check if you have any idea or perception of how far widespread some of these non-political actors are already acting in South America. Some of them are already acting in the context of Mexico, and other countries more closely aligned with the US. But I don't know if you know of any of these companies already working in some of Latin American countries.
For the visa topic, yes. They are well spread. And there's also the work of Maria Luisa Sanchez Barrueco, who has worked on this topic of visa outsourcing. On the other detention, I haven't encountered any reference to South America, rather Australia, New Zealand. There is a clear connection between UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, but not really, not for South America. But these companies, I mean, it's also tricky sometimes to follow how, because some companies might actually interact with local partners, and through local partners sell some technologies, or so I think there is more to research on that. Yeah, absolutely.
I would like to again give the opportunity to participants to raise questions. Is there anyone? I haven't seen anything. Okay, then, well, since we're just I think we have perhaps 2 more minutes. So let me ask another question to Federica. If I understand correctly, what you're saying about the inducing deportations through private and public cooperation is a kind of good cop, bad cop game, where the private side would presumably take the bad cop role. And normally also in involuntary returns and in deportations, there's several actors involved, right? Several public actors also. And so between them, they could also do a good cop, bad cop game. without any private involvement. What is the extra dimension coming in through private involvement?
Certainly the blame avoidance aspects. When you outsource a function, which is the running of detention center and the enforcing of expulsions, you are giving away your direct responsibility. It becomes also tricky to assess from a legal point of view who is accountable. And this has happened many times when something very bad, like the death of a detainee has happened. So where to locate legally the responsibility, it becomes more difficult. So there is this aspect of blame avoidance that I think it's key when you have a non-state actors, a private company involved. But there's also, I see your point about the bad cop and the good cop, but really it's because detention and expulsion is one of the policy area where policy goals are normally not achieved, because really returning people is something very hard to achieve. So you will always see a high discrepancy between orders to leave and actual returns. A way to respond to this, to the series of constraints that limits the capacity of states to enforce deportations, to respond to these constraints, private actors allow to give away the use of force, a series of aspects, and concentrate efforts on trying to persuade people to leave, which is actually the only way to achieve the objective of returns or expulsions. And so this is really in the case of the UK that I've studied more. I could see how the fact of having a private actor allows the state to concentrate only on trying to persuade people to leave voluntarily, meaning leaving with their consent.
Thank you very much for your answer. I think, unless there's any more questions or announcements or advertisements to make, I think we can wrap it up. I see Elisa is typing something in the chat. Well, she's saying thank you, and so do I. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
I think it was a great EU Latin America dialogue, and thank you so much for fitting into it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah, very interesting. Looking forward to the conversations as well to continue in the conference or any other instance. Nice to meet you, Federica, and Federica as well.
Nice to meet you. Great. So let's officially close the webinar.
Okay.